Second Samuel, 19th chapter, beginning in verse 41. Uh, I was not here on Wednesday night, but I did listen to Tim, and I noticed that he had not gotten through his thought slide. And so there were a couple of points in there I thought were good. Remembering back to what y'all discussed on Wednesday night, and the army of David being able to go out and defeat Absalom's army in the forest. And there's a couple of things that we ought to consider, and that is, one, that David had this deep love for Absalom, and it actually caused him some difficulty when it was time for him to make decisions. And but I think the key point is that Joab did come to him once again, and he did listen. Right? He did realize that he had to do something that was beyond just himself, because, as Tim discussed a couple of weeks ago, David's sphere of influence was not just 10 or 15 people, right? It was the entire kingdom. And so he has a bunch of men who've gone out to fought valiantly, fought valiantly for him. And yet when they come back, they almost come back as a shame, because they realize that Absalom, his son, did pass in the fighting. So Joab does rebuke him and come to him once again. So I think that's important that we see David listening to his advisors and to Joab specifically. And then we see at the very end where David actually reaches out and names Amasa as the leader and commander of his troops, of his army, and Amasa was the leader of Absalom's. And so that helped kind of tie everybody back together again, because he had a kingdom that was completely split apart. And so if he had not done something pretty significant, that would have been very difficult for him to even come back. And so now we pick up today, unless somebody else has some thoughts on that. Anyone? All right. So we pick up today and just a review of who some of the characters are, and then I went ahead and pulled out of the booklets that we handed down around page, I think, 20 or 21. There's actually a picture that depicts the relationships of some of these folks. And so Amasa is now the commander of David's army. He was the commander in Absalom's rebellion. We have Joab, who was his trusted advisor and commander, but now he falls under Amasa. Joab also is the one who killed Absalom, even when he was told not to. And then you have Abishai, who actually is Joab's brother, and another man named Ittai, who was the third commander when David sent them out. So here, I don't know how well you can read it. I tried to blow it up as big as I can and still retain everybody in the picture. But down here in the bottom corner, we have Absalom, right, David's son, who's just passed, who's just been killed by Joab. But we have the three brothers up here, Joab, Abishai, and Asahel. And Asahel died. And if you remember that story, Joab wound up revenging his death by killing a man named Abner, who had killed Asahel whenever he was chasing him down. We'll probably refer back to Abner here in a bit. And then we have Amasa, who's over here. So you can see that these are all nephews of David, because they're David's sister's children. And then they were all, they're all cousins to each other, and cousins of Absalom. But these are the commanders, and this is how they would fall out in the family tree. All right. So now we have this issue that begins in verse 41, where it says, "And behold, all the men of Israel came to the king and said to the king, Why had our brothers, the men of Judah, stolen you away and brought the king and his household, all and all David's men with him over the Jordan. So we have some folks that have become upset because David comes back. He's heading back to Jerusalem, and it's the men of Judah, and it's some men of Israel, but not all of them, are there to help him carry his stuff back across the Jordan and take him into Jerusalem. But some of them get upset because he didn't wait on them, apparently. So the men of Judah then reply, and we see this back and forth here in the next couple of verses. The men of Judah reply and says, because the king is our close relative, why are you angry about this matter? Have we eaten at all at the king's expense, or has anything been taken for us? But the men of Israel answered the men of Judah and said, we have 10 parts in the king. Therefore, we also have more claim on David than you. Why then did you treat us with contempt? Was it not our advice first to bring back our king? Yet the words of the men of Judah were harsher than the words of the men of Israel. And I think that's a very important point, especially with what happens, by the time we get to the end of this quarter. But we have this fight now between the other tribes of Israel and the tribe of Judah, who are just going out to help, one of their own actually come back into the city. And they make a valid statement, which is, it was like the men of Israel were ready for David to come back before Judah themselves were. So then we roll into chapter 20, and we have this man called Sheba. And I think it's important for us to see in the first verse, what is his description? Nobody can even read. So he's a worthless fellow. It's going to be tough if y'all can't read. No, he's a worthless fellow. So Sheba, and I thought about this actually when I was studying for this. I thought, how horrible would it be that in the Word of God, the first thing that's described about you is, Greg, a worthless fellow. That's not good. So Sheba here, and we see why he is a worthless fellow, because he stirs up people. So he tells them, we have no portion in David, every man to his tents, O Israel. So he's upset about the way Judah has approached this situation, and therefore he kind of stomps off and says, that's it, we're just going to go back to our tents. Therefore, starting this rift and this rebellion, what's titled in my Bible is Sheba's revolt, right? And the key is that the men of Israel do exactly that. They're frustrated. We just saw that Judah's words were harsher than Israel's, and so everybody's getting their feelings hurt, and so the men retreat, and Judah, though, remains with David, and they make sure that he gets all the way up into the city. All right, well, now once they get into the city, David has to, the first thing he does is he takes the concubines that he left behind, and he cares for them, sets them away, and then they are treated. He cares for them, makes sure that all their needs are met, but they are as widows, it says, so they're separated off. But then David says, okay, I need to deal with this specific problem with Sheba and what he's going to do to stir everyone up. So he calls his commander here, Amasa, right? And he says, you need to go out, you need to gather men, and you need to come back to me in 3 days. So Amasa runs off to do that, but then we have a situation that 3 days pass, he's not back, and now David needs to realize that he doesn't need to let this thing sit, right? He's got to do something about it. He's got to do something about it pretty quick. And so he calls Abishai and says, take the mighty men, right? Take these men that are here and go chase down Sheba to make sure that he doesn't get to a fortified city, because once he gets to a fortified city, it's going to be very tough to get him, right? Is the thought. And so they gather the men, and then they meet up actually with Amasa as he gets to the large stone in Gibeon, it says. Now, what David does here and the advice of Ahithophel to Absalom, are they similar? I think that's one of the questions. Remember the advice that Ahithophel gave to Absalom, which is, go right now, we can go take care and just kill David. There won't be a lot of bloodshed, and then that'll put that down. Remember that? He doesn't follow that advice, but David himself is following that similar thought pattern, right? I need to go, and if I can get rid of Sheba, then I think I can handle everyone else, and they'll come back. So, just a thought there to realize what the advice here is that he's following. So they meet up with Amasa. Joab is with them, and this is not the first time that Joab's going to handle something on his own, right? So last lesson we saw Joab killed Absalom, and the king specifically told them not to, right? Now, I mentioned Abner earlier. What had Joab done with Abner? He killed him. Was he supposed to kill him? No, he'd also been told not to kill him specifically too. But he did that out of revenge. Now, he runs into Amasa. Now, what does he do? Now, this is his cousin, right? So what does he do with him here? Yeah. So it says that he's dressed in full battle gear, right? He drops his sword or his dagger, bends down and picks it up. It's exposed. It says it reaches up and he grabs him by the beard as if to kiss him. And what does he do? He basically guts him right there in the middle of the highway. And so he drops to the ground, laying in this pool of blood. And Joab's like, all right, let's go. And so some of the men start following, but Joab leaves a young man behind. And that young man starts talking about, let's see, in chapter 20, it says in verse 11, now there stood by him one of Joab's young men and said, whoever favors Joab and whoever is for David, let him follow Joab. And we see in verse 12, but Amasa lays wallowing in his blood in the middle of the highway. And so when the men saw it, the people stood still. So they're kind of in shock to see this man who is their leader, or who was their leader just a few minutes ago, lying there dead, and the only people that have been around are them, right? We weren't in a battle. They were their own people. So the young man finally realizes that this isn't going to go well, and he drags his body off into the field and covers it, so that the men will move on. So he does that, and then all the men continue on, and they gather at a town called Abel Beth Maacah. And this is where Sheba has retreated to. Now, this is a fortified town, fortified city. And so Joab, being a man of war, immediately starts to besiege the city, right? And they start tearing this thing down. Yet, it says a wise woman comes out, asks to talk to them, and Joab comes up and talks to her, and she goes through this back and forth about, that they used to come, what was it said? 18 thing. Then she spoke, saying, formerly they used to say they will surely ask the advice at Abel, and thus they ended the dispute. So she's trying to figure out what it's going to take to stop them from tearing their city walls down. Joab's pretty, straightforward and says, well, Sheba's a man that's hiding in that city, and if you give him to me, then we're all good. So, so she says, give me a minute and I'll throw his head over the wall. Right? She goes back in, explains to the people, this is what's going to happen, right? Our city's going to be destroyed, or we give Sheba up. And so what do people do? They run, grab Sheba, cut his head off, throw it over the wall. And now Joab, immediately, he blows the trumpets, all the men stop what they're doing, they leave, and now everything's good as far as they're concerned. So they leave the city alone and do not drop it into ruin. But so I think that's about it for chapter 20. We see in verse 23 the reordering of who's in charge. Joab was over the whole army of Israel, so now he's gotten his job back. And then it lists several other folks who are over the various pieces, and Zadok and Abiathar were the priests. And so that ends this episode in this period, and then we open up in chapter 21. Now, in chapter 21, we see that there's been a famine in the year. There's been a famine in the area, and it's been going on for 3 years. So David, it says, sought the presence of the Lord, and the Lord said, it is for Saul and his bloody house, because he put the Gibeonites to death. So who are the Gibeonites if we go back into history? Do we remember the Gibeonites whenever, and I just lost his name. Whenever they came into the land to conquer it initially, Joshua. Remember that there were these people that came and they acted like they were from a long way off, and they wore the tattered shoes and they had the moldy bread, and they did all this to act as if they had come from a far distance and begged Joshua to be peaceful to them. And Joshua makes a mistake, because what does he not do? Yeah, he doesn't inquire of God, right? And we see a lot of this, that every time we have this big situation or a problem that's going to exist, that the man did not consult or ask God what he should do here. So Joshua assumes that these people are from a long way off because they lied and said they were, and he has a treaty with them, and then finds out that they're Gibeon, which is a town that was not too far away from them. And so now that oath is struck, and the people are saved. However, they are turned into kind of a slave workforce. Right? They cut wood and did all sorts of things for the Israelites because they lied, but they were not killed. And so now we see this comment from the Lord that says, Saul and his bloody house, because he put the Gibeonites to death. And in verse 2, we see the reason. It says that, so the king called the Gibeonites and spoke to them. And then in the parenthetical here, now the Gibeonites were not of the sons of Israel, but the remnant of the Amorites, and the sons of Israel made a covenant with them. But Saul had sought to kill them in his zeal for the sons of Israel and Judah. So some point during Saul's reign, Saul decides to rid Israel of all these foreigners. So he goes after and he tries to kill all the Gibeonites. What's the problem, though? They already had a promise, right? They had a promise that they wouldn't be destroyed. Saul doesn't Saul doesn't consult God about that, nor does he seem to, even entertain that thought. So he just goes off to kill them all. So he obviously has not succeeded, because David then gathers some of the Gibeonites together and says, what can I do to make this thing better, right? What can I do to solve this, to atone, that you may bless the inheritance of the Lord? So in verse 4, we see the Gibeonites, talking about, well, it's not about money and killing a bunch of people. And David says, okay, well, I'll do whatever you ask. And so in verse 5 and 6, their response is, the man who consumed us and who planned to exterminate us from remaining within any border of Israel, let 7 men from his sons be given to us, and we will hang them before the Lord in Gibeah of Saul, the chosen of the Lord. And the king says, I will give them. So they just simply ask for 7 of Saul's sons, and that they will hang them there publicly and make sure that everyone understands that he did wrong. David allows that to happen. And then in the next few verses, he talks about who he takes and who he spares. And so here is another family tree that's also in your book. It's the one, I think, right before David's family tree that we saw earlier. And I highlighted who is chosen from here. Now, we do know that Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, is alive, right? So he's one that would be eligible. But what does it say about David and Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan? That's right. And I think that's important, because the whole problem is that there was a violation of the oath, right? And David himself has made an oath to Jonathan about Mephibosheth. And so he's not going to violate that oath in order to, fulfill another. And so he does not take Mephibosheth, who's up there in green, he does not take him and say, here's one of the sons. Yet instead, he takes 2 sons of Rizpah, and let's see here. And we read about her as a daughter of Saul. We read about her in 2 Samuel, the 3rd chapter, and verse 7. So if you want to turn over there, what is happening in 2 Samuel chapter 3? Falls back to the time of Abner. Saul has died in battle, and Ishbosheth is kind of stood up in his place, and Abner is his commander of the army. And yet, in verse 7, what do we see that Ishbosheth says to Abner? Anyone want to read it? So he accuses Abner of going into his father's concubine, who was Rizpah. Right? Already in the verse, the concubine they're talking about is Rizpah. So we see that Abner is at least accused of this. He doesn't deny it, but he starts to get angry about who I am, and you can't say that to me. So it's kind of like the reaction that we would have if we got caught doing something. You can't say that to me. I didn't do anything wrong. So that's where we hear of Rizpah. And she has 2 sons that he chooses to send. One of them's name is actually Mephibosheth as well, but it is not the son of Jonathan. And then then we see that he chooses 5 sons from uh, Merib. And I'll probably butcher all these names, and I know that I say them all differently than Tim, so hopefully you can follow our discussions. But in 1 Samuel, the 18th chapter, is the first time that we hear anything about her. And we can begin reading in verse 17. I'll do that so everyone can hear. 1 Samuel chapter 18, verses 17 through 19. And there's some words in here, so just be prepared, but they're going to be butchered. Then Saul said to David, "Here is my older daughter, Merab. I will give her to you as a wife, only to be a valiant man for me and fight the Lord's battles." For Saul thought, "My hand shall not be against him, but let the hand of the Philistines be against him." But David said to Saul, "Who am I, and what is my life or my father's family in Israel, that I should be a king's son-in-law?" So it came about at the time when Merab, Saul's daughter, should have been given to David, that she was given to Adriel the Mahalathite for a wife. So she had been offered to David for a wife. We see in verse 20 that Saul does finally give Michal as his wife, and then they have some issues later on, especially when David has to run away and leave her behind. But now, this is the woman. That's how we know that who she married and who his father is. But she had 5 sons, and so these are the two. These are the 2 families which he chooses to take the 7 young men from. And it's a very sad story, and it's unfortunate that we talked early on about consequences of our decision, right? And David had consequences from the decisions he made, and now here are those that are just in Saul's family that are having to deal with the consequences of Saul's decision whenever he was the king. So they're handed over. It says right about the time of the harvest, they did hang those young men, and we see Rizpah in verse 10 of chapter 21 of 2 Samuel. We see her. She says she took a sackcloth and spread it for herself on the rock from the beginning of the harvest until it rained on them from the sky. And she allowed neither birds of the sky to rest on them by day or beasts of the field by night. So she sat there as she watched her two sons, and then 5 of her what would be nephews, I guess, at that point. She would be, it wouldn't be nephews in a second. But as she stood there and watched these young men as they died, and made sure that animals didn't come up on them and tear them apart. So with that, word gets back to David, and David makes a decision here based upon, I think, several things. One is he knows that Saul was appointed by God. He knows that his friend Jonathan and the promises he made to him, and he sees the reaction of this mother and Rizpah with the children that were killed, and he tells his men to go get the bones of Saul and Jonathan, and they go to Jabesh Gilead, because the men in Jabesh Gilead had gone and stolen the bones out of the square of the Philistines after they had been struck down and strung up there. So he gets Saul's bones, Jonathan's bones, and goes up and gets these 5 young men's bones, and then takes them down into the tribe of Benjamin's area at a town called Zelah, verse 14. And it says that they were all buried in the grave of Kish, their father. So Saul's father's name's Kish, and they put them in the grave there. And in the last verse that we'll study today, at the end of verse 14, it says, and after that, God was moved by prayer for the land. Right. So now we can think about some of the stories that we've heard here and some of the lessons that we can draw from that. Excuse me. So how important is wise counsel or knowing the right thing to do? Right? We have Ahithophel's counsel, which I had mentioned earlier. And what if that had been followed? Right? That was actually wise counsel. Yeah, a lot of things could have changed, especially specifically for David, had that counsel been followed and been successful. God was with David, so I don't know that it would have been successful, but that was wise counsel. And here, the wise woman in the city where Sheba was staying, right, was hiding out. She comes out and she realizes there's you know, much to be gained by turning over this one who has gone against David. So she influences the people to react, and they do. They get rid of that. But how important is it for us today? And then how can we get wise counsel today? I agree. For those who couldn't hear, Randy talked about a couple of proverbs that talked about wise counsel and the multiplicity of counsel, and the fact that we can and should, you know, ask people's opinion of certain things, people who we trust their counsel, right? And also go to God in prayer and try to get, you know, a better understanding of the things that we ought to do, looking into His Word, understanding, you know, some of the impacts that we have, and we can get that by talking to others that we trust, and maybe those who have been through it before. So, very important lesson to learn, that we can't just always go out on our own and do what we think, you know, do whatever we think. Mm, that's right. Right. True. Yeah. Correct. Doug, did you have something? And we'll see later, but I mean, we've kind of seen it also in Ahithophel and his counsel to Absalom. Right? Sometimes the counsel that we accept is the counsel that we want to hear. Right? And that's where we have a trap. And I think what Tim said as well, which is, sometimes the counsel doesn't come from the source that you think that it maybe is the best source. And so there's a lot of factors, and it can be pretty brutal at times, right? In its delivery, but we have to be able to, hold ourselves, not be selfish, and be selfless, and understand there could be a lot in some of these words that we are hearing, and how do we make that decision and apply it. When Tim was talking about that, it made me think of several things and several times that, sometimes we are so close because it is the situation that we are in, right? We are so close and so tied into whatever is occurring that seeking somebody from the outside to, that's looking in, it's so much easier. So, Nathan comes in and he tells David this story about this man who goes off and he steals this lamb and he brings it into his house, yet he had plenty. And David's immediate reaction is, that's ridiculous, right? This man must be killed immediately. And then what? Yeah, that's you. Right? You had all of this stuff, yet you still coveted somebody else's stuff. And then you sinned. And so sometimes it's a lot easier, or many times I would say it's a lot easier for some third party to be looking on the outside and give some counsel that we would never think of ourselves because we're just too intimately involved in it. Right. Yeah. No, I would agree. This humility is extremely important, and I think we see that it's an important factor in being a king because we don't see that in some of the other kings that come along, and it's to their demise. All right, and then finally, just got about 30 seconds or so, but finally, this concept of how important is our word. Even Joshua, who gave his word to the Gibeonites many years ago in an oath. Now Saul comes in, breaks that oath, and now the children of Israel are being punished by famine for it because that oath was broken. How important is it today for us when we say something that we're going to do, that we follow through with that? Sometimes very difficult to do that. And David himself doesn't even send Mephibosheth, Jonathan's son, to his death there because of the oath that he made. All right. See, Wednesday was, I think we start into several different, kind of gets choppy now as far as the verses. So look in your books, and because I don't have it right here with me, but look in your books and see where we'll be reading. It chops up a little bit. We go over into Chronicles as well, I think. So Tim will have it on Wednesday. I'll be out of town once again, unfortunately. But thank you for your participation. Thanks.